My guest this week is Daniel Rachel. Daniel is a Birmingham-born, best-selling author whose previous works include Isle of Noises, Conversations with Great British Writers, Don't Look Back in Anger, The Rise and Fall of Cool Britannia, The Lost Album of the Beatles, What If the Beatles Hadn't Split Up, Oasis, Nebworth, Two Nights That Will Live Forever, and the co-author of Ranking Rogers' autobiography, I Can't Stop It, My Life in the Beat. In 2021, Rachel was the guest curator of the Two-Tone Lives and Legacies exhibition, and he curated the anniversary edition of the Selectors' debut album, Too Much Pressure. But out this summer in 2024 is his new book, Too Much Too Young, Rude Boys, Racism, and the Soundtrack of a Generation. An incredible near 500-page book all about the era. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome to Revolutions Per Movie, Daniel Rachel. Hi, Daniel.
Hi, Chris.
So good to see you.
London calling.
Yes. You've written this amazing book. I ordered it from England because I was obsessed when I saw it was coming out. Too Much Too Young, Rude Boys, Racism, and the Soundtrack of a Generation. You were just a kid when ska hit. You felt it in real time.
Yeah, exactly. I was a schoolboy, and it just swept across the school playground, really. Before I knew it, people were talking about the specials. I think they were the entry point, actually. I think around the time of Too Much Too Young, I probably would have seen stuff on Top of the Pops, but it probably hadn't registered. But then as it turned into 1980, yeah, Too Much Too Young was definitely, that's my abiding memory of discovering two-tone.
Right. But what preceded the ska movement on your playground? Like, what was in the air?
Teachers telling us off. Girls.
But I mean, culturally, musically, I know my wife is from Scotland, and she just says music movements and fashion movements just sweep through a nation.
Yeah, tribal groups were fast and moving across the British cultural landscape all the time. But I don't think it had properly got me as a kid. But I mean, just before, it would have been mod because of a resurgent interest through the Jam and Paul Weller, and then the Who's Quadrophenia, the film version of that album, and that was having a big effect. So there was fleets of scooters and people wearing parkas with targets on the back. But no, I don't think I had started to dress in a tribal culture until two-tone.
Yeah, in the States, I'd seen photographs of the Specials and Madness before hearing them, and they sounded exactly like they looked. You know, by the time I did hear it, I was like, yeah, Madness sounded like it had that carnival fairground thing, Mike Parson pop thing about them.
Yeah.
But it was also a music that I'd never heard before. I had no relation to ska. I hadn't heard reggae yet. I was 12, in Portland, Oregon. So what's really amazing in your book is just how short this movement was. I mean, the Specials burned hot and bright for a little over 2 years in recorded time. And the Selector was like, what, a year and some months?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, I think that 2 years for a pop movement is a long time.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it certainly extended what punk had done and achieved, which was even shorter in many ways. So to from the initial release of Gangsters to Ghost Town is 2 years, and then of course the Specials then continue as Special AKA, which gives them even longer time as a functioning band. And Madness, of course, run all the way into the mid-80s, and the Beat do too. But yeah, the initial burst of the Selector is very short, and the Body Snatchers shorter still. But yeah, as a tribal movement, it's I think that's a long time. But it doesn't matter either way, does it? I mean, the thing is that the records were big, and at the time they hit and immediately hit the top echelons of the charts, and the music has sustained in many respects. But I think like you, as I began to buy the records, it was a short step to wanting to then go back into the source material of what was two-tone. And and there were so many compilations and reissues happening, whether it was Cimarip and Skinhead Moonstomp and that record, or Ska Intensified, which for me was a world into Jamaican music of the 60s. And I soon began to make those connections and understandings, and then find the originals that these bands were covering or updating with their own kind of added lyricism and musicality. But that just made it all the more exciting, in the same way as if you discovered mod just a couple of years earlier, you were taken back to not dissimilar musical roots of 60s ska, you know.
Yeah, and again, like you said, I had that 12-inch of Too Much Too Young, and on the flip side was a lot of those covers, Long Shot Kick the Bucket.
You had a 12-inch?
A 12-inch, yeah, it was a Japanese 12-inch. And and it had like Long Shot Kick the Bucket. It was like a medley.
Yeah. I nicked the lyrics of that 12-inch from a Virgin Megastore, but I couldn't afford the actual vinyl. But so that was in the States, was it? The 12-inch vinyl? Because that's, you rarely see that in the UK.
Yeah, we had a pretty amazing store here that had all that stuff, and that was what I mean. It felt longer than it was, because by the time I discovered it, it was kind of, Selector were done, specials were finishing up. Having a body of work by all these artists at one time, it felt vast. So it felt longer, especially in the States where the movements were, so regional and spread out. You may not know of a band in Boston until long after they've broken up, and just finding access to distribution and things like that. But I had the same thing like you. I was putting the pieces together. I also found a specials bootleg where they were doing tons of covers. And so at first I thought they were originals. And then you just kind of start putting the pieces together and reading interviews and articles about the movement.
What was the bootleg?
It had a cigarette pack on the cover.
From Japan?
I think it was made in the States.
Okay, because you could get Japanese gangster cigarettes.
Oh, wow. Maybe that's what was on the cover. That's incredible. Yeah. The amazing thing in your book that I really didn't know that much about was, obviously, Jerry Dammers was, the leader of the two-tone label, but I had no idea how much autonomy he had creating that label through Chrysalis. Can you talk a little bit about how he created this incredible indie label and was able to navigate that world?
I mean, Jerry always wanted to be a pop star. And so that's why he's pushing forward the specials. But at the same time, as the specials and his concept of what a movement could be coalesced, he kind of thought there'd be strength in numbers by bringing more bands into the two-tone identity. So when they approach record labels, or when record labels approach them, as it turned out, Mick Jagger of Rolling Stones Records, Richard Branson at Virgin, what they said, these labels, was, if you want the specials, you take the two-tone identity, and with that, you will agree to record up to 10 bands a year, which you will fund, and we will put out. But at the end of when that record's released, they have the freedom to do whatever they want. No contract. They can stay with two-tone, do another record. They can go off and do what they want. And of course, Chrysalis, who were the band that came in the strongest and went for it, said, "Who are the other bands?" And Jerry Dammers said, "I have no idea." But soon enough, he brought forward Madness, then the Selector, the Beat, Body Snatchers. But yeah, that Chrysalis allowed Jerry autonomy to choose the music, the records that would be released, the artwork. It was a fait accompli that each time that was presented to Chrysalis, and they pretty much just signed it off. In theory, that the autonomy then broke down within two-tone itself to include a cooperative of 14 people, which was 7 members of Special, 7 members of Selector. But ultimately, that decision-making rested on the benevolent dictator, Jerry.
I was also blown away that it lasted till like 86.
Yeah.
I had no idea till I read your book that there was, the Higsons, the Friday Club, these bands that I just had never heard of. Were they known at all by the time the movement was over?
Yeah, it's a good question, and and it was a decision I had to make when I wrote the book. Is do I end the book at Ghost Town? In the same way as, say, Noel Gallagher might say, end the story of Oasis at Nebworth with a 250,000 people screaming at us, end on the high point, but no, I mean, Jerry continued the label, and of course you have to include the Special AKA because they're all important, and the single Nelson Mandela. But with all of the bands having exited the label, and the idea of ska influenced music, driving these bands, Jerry then looked to a new style of music, a kind of a British funk, a take on the Talking Heads, if anything, really. So those two bands, Higsons and Apollinaires, have that sound. Not that the audiences knew, because they got a fair splattering of people turning up in black and white and pork pie hats, expecting a kind of renaissance of the original two-tone idea. But were they known? Not massively. I mean, the Higsons had released singles already, and one of those, I Don't Want to Live with Monkeys, had been a big independent hit, and they were attracting interest in the British music press, and in fact they would come across to the States on the back of a two-tone single, Run Me Down, and have a bit of a college hit. The Apollinaires got a bit of mainstream radio play in the UK, but nothing significant happened to them either before, during, or after. They're very much a forgotten band in many ways, but it hasn't stopped certain DJs picking back up on those tracks, and it was an attempt that was interesting, and it provides a good story, I think, for a couple of chapters within the book, to see what Two Tone tried to do, where it was at, and what a new wave of musicians influenced by the old wave of two-tone bands attempted to do, with Jerry producing some of those records. And of course, the lead singer of the Higsons would go on to be one of the most successful comedians on British television in the 1990s as one part of the Far Show. I don't know if that makes it to the States, but also as an author, and he still is an author in, not only of the children's books, but or teenage books, but he did the Young Bond series, the James Bond series, and continues to be successful as an author today, way more successful than he ever was as a musician. But Charlie Higson's an interesting person to look up.
So we're going to talk about a film dear to my heart, Dance Craze, 1981. Yeah. I saw this when it came out in an independent movie theater in Portland, Oregon. And I have such vivid memories of it, waiting for it to start, because people were like going down the aisle like madness. Everyone was dressed up. It was like these bands had not made it our way. Right. This was our chance to see this movement. And I just remember it just buzzing. And again, like you said, there were scooters outside, so there was a mod hangover. Because, in the States, it was all meshed up, like you're into like American hardcore starting to come in a bit. You've got your ska influences, your new wave thing. It was a little bit messier, but oh my gosh, did you see this when it came out?
I don't think I did. I got the album in 1981,
sure,
the soundtrack album, but I don't think I saw the film until it was released on VHS, which is quite a number of years later. I think that's the case. And but I think it did for you what it did for me, and served what the original ambition was, which was a film primarily for school kids and people too young to have been able to get into the gigs. And here were all the two-tone bands for the price of a cinema ticket. And when it was originally when it toured theatres originally in the UK, I think, as I recall, it was in the school holidays to maximise the potential of young people being able to go and see it. But I mean, it's quite incredible because you not only get the main thrust of band specials, Madness, Selector, Body Snatchers, you also get the Bad Manners invited onto the soundtrack and onto the film, and they're all there one after another on celluloid on the big screen as if it's one gigantic party and gig. It's almost like the scene in A Hard Day's Night when each four of the Beatles walk into separate doors, and then it crosses through over the threshold, and there they are all in the same house. It looked like two-tone musicians all toured and lived together. You know, it wasn't the reality thing, but we could dream, couldn't we?
Well, it's also so amazing because, you know, there's that thing where the bands separately are creating their own version in the movement, right? Just all of a sudden they're like, hey, there's this band Madness we should go check out. You know, so the specials go down. Even though there was some friendly competition within the groups, it was amazing how Jerry Dammers was like, come be part of this as long as you want.
Yeah.
It's so unusual. And in the book, he's a very tortured individual too, because of the weight of the label, the tour, the personalities, mental illness. So much is playing into the part of this short-lived scene.
Yeah.
You know, this film is interesting because Joe Massot is a really fascinating character in your book. He directed the film Wonderwall, which was an Apple film.
Yeah.
In '68. He is notorious for shooting the first shoot of The Song Remains the Same by Led Zeppelin and screwing it up so badly that they have to reshoot and fake stage settings of Madison Square Gardens later on a soundstage to cut into the film because he just did a horrible job. And so, like, when you watch Song Remains the Same, you're watching two different shoots. And, you know, you have John Paul Jones in like a fake wig because he had cut his hair. And the fact that he snakes his way into this as well through just seeing Madness at a swimming pool in LA and going like, what's that? You know, and his son being like, oh, Dad, come on. You know, you got to do specials, man.
Yeah.
It's a wild story.
Yeah. And I you know, Joe Massot's obviously died now, but I spoke to his wife at the time and to his son, who you just mentioned, Jason, who was 14 at the time. And Jason suspects that his dad had CIA involvement, something to do with drugs and Cuba and Mexican cartels. This kind of very shady character, which is just adds to it all, really. And you know, in the same way as he got sacked off the Zeppelin film, he gets removed by Chrysalis off Dance Craze because he doesn't quite have the street charm that these bands want from a director. So he rubs up against Joey and he rubs up against Madness, and the visual concept of the film comes from Joe Dunton, and he then takes over ostensibly direction, but also Chrysalis bringing Joseph Losey's son, Garvick. And Garvick, who's got quite a history himself, but most recently has been involved in Babylon, a film about Black British kids in 1980.
That's an incredible film.
Yeah, so Garvick Losey kind of plays the cards just right to get this film over the line, and it's great that Garvick contributed to the film and kind of tells his version of how it happens. But it's yeah, I mean, all those kind of back stories are really fascinating, and it's only at towards the end that specials agree to be filmed, and such is the kind of the distrust that eventually the Beat agree to it, and they're filmed in New Jersey because.
That's incredible.
Yeah. So if you look closely at the film, you can see quite clearly on the front of the stage that that's an American audience, So you can see where at that very point in time, mid 1980, it's a great comparison between how this in the States rude boys and girls are dressing and how they are over here, you know. And of course, do remember that although this is capturing that first thrust of two-tone, this is the 1980 version of it. Some of it from early 1980, so Selector says February, March, whereas Specials, Body Snatchers extends into the into autumn of 1980, into the fall in your language. And so you get kind of more Specials materials on the soundtrack. And added to that, not only is the performance of, say, for example, Selector, the original Selector, the soundtrack is the Reform Selector from the latter part of 1980. So you've got
so weird.
You've got two different versions there, which I don't think, for example, Charlie Anderson, the bass player Selector, knew. And I was aware as he was posting stuff on Facebook that I was writing. He was posting about, you know, why aren't I on the poster? Why is the original version on the free poster that's in the soundtrack album? Well, because it's not the original Selector that's on the album, and so you get the reformed version on the poster that you got free with the album. Did you get the poster free in the States?
My version did not come with the poster, and now I'm pissed.
Yeah, you got 6 images of the bands.
Yeah, and it was mixed and produced by Clive Langer and Alan Winstanley, who did a lot of Madness stuff, correct?
Virtually every single record they ever made, but then went on to do Bowie and Morrissey and a whole host of people. Dexys, Midnight Runners.
The film sounds amazing.
The album or the
film and the album I think sound great, but the album has a lot of remixing, right?
Yes.
Yeah, they've done because in the film there's a ton of clam notes, especially for Madness. You're like, oh, ooh.
Yeah, but you want that, don't you? You wouldn't go and see the Rolling Stones and everything would be perfect. That's what makes the Stones such a great live band.
No, but it's funny because, you know, it's like Lee Thompson, you're like, oh yeah, he's still learning. You know, like there's just a charm to it. I have no problem with it.
And what's important, I mean, this is something that Nicky Summers talks about in the book about the Body Snatchers, is that, as far as she remembered, they were of punk. And of punk meant you didn't have to have professionalism. And yet the Specials are hugely professional and great players. And so you do get this strange rub in two-tone bands where some of them, as you know, have come out of punk and think you just strap on an instrument and you do what you can, but it's about what you've got to say. Whereas other musicians within it are people that have gone through other iterations of bands and know how to write songs, how to play, and are saying, no, let's really land this music so it sounds brilliant as best it possibly can do.
But it's funny in your book too, you know, the Specials were pretty wobbly when they first started, like partway through that Clash tour they were on. They really started ramping up the energy and speeding up the tempos. And it's really funny to read, like people were kind of like, yeah, the Specials are okay. And then they just got blazing hot and focused and became the Specials that we know.
Well, it's kind of not surprising in one respect because, you know, I mean, I was always in bands and it takes a long time for a band to gel. And Jerry was cherry picking musicians within Coventry from different bands saying you'd be good because you can play in this way, and you'll be good because you have a punk ethic, and you should be in it because you're black and it needs to be a multicultural band. And so some of these people have got experience, but they're trying to find how to make the Specials work. And when you listen to the early demos are recorded, you know, with the financing of Pete Waterman, who would go on in the latter 80s to be one third responsible for Stock Aitken and Waterman and Kylie Minogue and that whole movement. I mean, those early demos, dubbed as the Coventry Automatics, do reveal, you know, in Terry Hall, a singer lacking in kind of on-stage confidence in live experience because his voice is weak. It's not quite there. The band aren't gelling and don't really know how to switch from a reggae offbeat to a rock onbeat, and you really feel it. And you even, I mean, if you listen closely in many ways, you hear it on Gangsters, and you can hear it, especially in Terry Hall on the first Specials album. And if you compare that to that two-tone, Too Much Too Young EP that you mentioned right at the beginning, the confidence in Terry Hall as a singer has shifted because they've suddenly done 15 back-to-back live dates. The band are suddenly really full on and playing as if their life depended upon it in a way that is different to the recording of the album, which is done just as the band go out on the two-tone tour. And I'm not saying that the album isn't brilliant, because it's got a naivety and an innocence and a rawness about it that you wouldn't replace for anything. But it's shifted by the EP, and I think that's why that EP is released, and Jerry wants to do it in the new year of 1980, because it shows where the band has changed. And then just within 2 or 3 months, April of 1980, they go in the studio and record more specials. We as listeners don't hear more specials until, you know, the latter part of 1980, but it's from April 1980. So in less than 6 months, the shift from album 1 to album 2 is quite extraordinary. And I think what we get on the Dance Craze soundtrack, both the album and the film, is all of these bands really played in and gigged in, and it really leaps off the screen, doesn't it? That their confidence and their abilities, and you know, just the dynamic. Just watching Pauline Black is just astonishing, isn't it? She leaps out of the screen with just her energy and positiveness. It's quite incredible.
It's also shot with a Steadycam, so you have this really fluid camera work at times. Like when the film opens, which was interesting. I want to talk to you about that at some point too when we get to the middle section of the film. But there are some choices in the film, and it starts with like some movie tone, kind of like British dance hall dialogue, you know, from an old film. So it'll be like, Oliver Britton signs like this flash their nightly invitations in response to more than 500,000 people who go dancing every week all year round. And then right into nightclub. The really amazing thing about this movement was the visual identity of the band. I mean, when the logos come up of each band, it's killer. Like, they had such an amazing iconography in terms of just the way they laid out the name of their band.
Yeah, I mean those snippets of Look at Life, which was 10-minute features on British and Pathé News, I think is the stamp of Joe Dunton, whereas the logo speaks of the artistic background of many of the musicians. So within the Specials, Jerry, Horace and Brad all went to art school. In the Body Snatchers, Penny and Sarah Jane had been at art school, and so they created the Body Snatchers logo. You know, the Beat brought in Hunt Emerson to design the Beat Girl. But again, it just adds to the whole seduction that we felt at the time, that these are things you could draw on your school book and on your Harrington and wherever else. It gives it an identity, and also reaffirms why Jerry was confident that this could be autonomous from a major record label. They didn't need the help of art departments. I mean, they do lean on the art department at Chrysalis, but they were capable of doing it themselves, and at times do. But the Steadicam was originated by Garrett Brown, and when the Beat come over, filmed in New Jersey, Joe Dunton invites Garrett Brown to film, so he's one of the cameramen of the Beat footage, which is a brilliant thing. And for listeners, the Steadicam, the innovation of that is it acts like you have a harness wrapped around your body. So you're not holding the camera, which means that it literally is a steady camera, and enabled the camera people to get onto the stage and thrust the camera right into the faces of the musicians. And you can see Pauline Black looking over at Joe Dunton at one point, as if to say, what are you doing? And then other times you get a playfulness of the musicians. Jerry goes and looks into the screen, or Terry Hall comes up and laughs It's adonically down the lens. And interestingly, like you said about the refilming, of Zeppelin at Madison Square Garden, there's two moments of where the musicians are asked to come to a studio in Wembley in North London. One is for the Boot Ballet, which is the Doc Martens of Madness to complement Swan Lake. And the other part is the fight sequence in Selector Too Much Pressure, which, although they filmed as it happened on stage, they decided to reshoot it to really maximize the malevolence that was running through Selector, where they literally could kick in one another and swing some punches because they really weren't getting on with each other.
So much conflict going on. Brilliant people, chemistry bands. They need, as much as Elvis Costello at the time was like, I think you should get rid of Roddy or he doesn't add anything. I think he's brilliant in the specials. Yes. And the band would be so different without him. It's just such a cool combination of rock to what they were doing. As a kid, when I first saw Dance Craze, I was really confused by the violence on stage, staged violence. So when I see Jerry Dammers run over to Neville and leap on him, and then Neville pull him across the stage by his feet, and then just start laying blows into him, like, I'm just like, the keyboardist has lost his mind through the music. He's so excited. And this guy who's in a band with him is like, you're a moron. I'm going to teach you to go back to your keyboard. Reading about it, and learning more about it as a kid, even, I kind of put it together. But just that first glimpse of it, I had no context that this was a staging of race relations on stage.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a theatricality that runs through Dance Craze, which is, in essence, capturing what was happening in the live arena. And you see the fun part of it with Jerry and Neville, and you see Neville pushing Linval, and at different times, as Horace reveals in the book, they had stage bottles that you could smash over people's heads. And then you see it when Lee in Madness is singing Razorblade Alley, and Chaz Smash is kind of dancing around him. And every time Lee looks over, Chaz has sunk to his knees so he can't see who it is that's playing up. And then that theatricality, as you say, had a greater purpose, which was with the Selector. There was a lot of fighting at two-tone gigs, and the Selector decided, well, what if we just drop our instruments and fight or pretend to fight on stage? It will shock an audience into stopping what they're doing and look at us and going, hang on, bands aren't meant to fight. And then hopefully they will then, when we pick up our instruments, forget their hatred of one another and just go, oh, let's just get on with the dancing. But unfortunately, for multiple reasons, there's the fighting in the Selector becomes real. And so at times they take it out on each other, when they're just meant to be play acting. But that theatricality, I mean, I think I didn't probably, like you, probably wasn't certain why it was happening and what was going on when you saw not only on Dance Craze, but on other live footage of these two-tone bands, this kind of goading of one another. But I certainly was drawn to it, and theatre would become an important part of my life. And I think that just adds to a depth within two-tone that when you explore more, and like you read about and I read about, and here on the streets of Britain, we had no choice but to see that there was neo-Nazis and right-wing activists that were marching the streets of Britain and were being confronted by the Anti-Nazi League and Rock Against Racism. And that was feeding into where two-tone was coming from. And there was a literal battle of youth determining which way so this generation would go. Would it go down a kind of racist, misogynistic, anti-Semitic avenue, or would it go another way to the cultural brilliance and beauty of two-tone, which was offering a harmonious way of being guided by your favorite bands?
I wanted to ask you a bit more about the skinhead movement.
Well, skinheads in Britain started in the late 60s and then into the early 70s, and essentially skinheads are not. It's not a racist cult or a tribe, but elements of it became that. So even in the there was agitation against South Asians who would and people that had come over from Uganda in the early 70s to Britain. And then when there was a skinhead revival in the late 70s, that then certainly was brought into the two-tone actively by Madness, Bad Manners, Specials, and you see it in the clothing, then because of the mix of what was happening culturally and politically, socially on the streets, the skinhead movement certainly took on a racist element, and for the press became synonymous with racism, and it became, and as all of the musicians on Two Tone talk about in Too Much Too Young, it was hard to know what a skinhead was. I mean, if you look at photographs of many of the specials, they are, Jerry used to dress as a skinhead, with Doc Marten boots, jeans rolled up, denim jacket, Fred Perry, or Ben Sherman shirts. But you couldn't tell, what a skinhead was until they told you, or hit you or stabbed you. You never know which way it would go. And in some cities, like where I grew up in Birmingham, skinhead racists wore red laces, and that was a signifier.
Okay.
In later years, in the 80s, that changed again when gay people kind of took the Doc Marten and laced them with pink or bright colours. So again, there's very, in the same way as that mod focused on very small identifying areas of coolness, the length of a tie or the cut of a jacket or the fingers you could put under your shirt. So there were identifying features of racism that could be identified.
How did the UK press feel about the movement? Were they supportive of it?
Yeah, initially there was just absolute love, and they were across the media, kind of in a spectacular way, really. Just on the glossy front covers of smash hits, and then it began to bleed into the national press. But in the early months of 1980, it certainly turned in certain quarters, and Two Tone became very protective of who, and through the Chrysalis press office, they became protective of who Two Tone bands talked to and which press were allowed to have interviews and exclusives. And so there then became a mixed dialogue of the Selector got pointed out in the London Standard that they were Sieg Heilers. They were promoting this, and here's a band that had 6 black members and 1 white. They couldn't get it any more wrong. So yeah, the press is very mixed, and I do go into that, and then in the book, and at times they hone in on are the original Jamaican artists who have influenced some of this music, and in some areas are co-songwriters, are they getting due royalties? And so that becomes another area of examination. And then as the music changes, again, there's questioning of, as always, the British music press are invariably horrible. So they get it. And they just want a story over, they don't appreciate musicianship and songwriting a lot of the time, and they just prefer to have a go, and don't want to reward people who are adventurous and try different things.
Yeah, I've heard from several people about that the English press loves to build it up and they love to tear it down. They don't want anyone to get too high.
Well, I think this speaks of the speed of movements. So at the simultaneous to Two Tone, you have the rise of Adam the Ants, and then the kind of the tsunami of new romanticism coming through from so many different bands, and they run at exactly the same time as Two Tone. So then the press have got to make a choice. Well, are we going to stick with Two Tone? Are we going to cater for all the different youth tribe movements? Or are we just going to champion a new one? And they go with championing new ones and neglecting the old. And so that becomes harder still for bands to survive when perhaps they're still making great music, but they're not getting the attention or the space in the media that they perhaps need.
Well, let's talk about some of the performances in the film. I mean, to me, it feels like it's a Specials movie. Every performance in it that is amazing. Like you're like, oh, madness. They're doing Night Boat to Cairo. When you put it back to back next to a Specials performance of Man at the CNA or Nightclub, it's like it kind of wipes the slate clean.
Right.
But Madness at this point was arguably the biggest band in the two-tone movement.
In mid 1980, sorry, 1981. No, still the Specials, because the Specials have had 2 #1 records. Too Much Young and Ghost Town. Madness are now getting top 10 after another. The beats are kind of on a kind of wavering, and the Selector have imploded. But I had the privilege of, just before the publication of the book, that Jerry invited me to come and see a screening of Dance Craze. And we went to see it, and I thought it'd be like hundreds of people, and it turned out it was just me and him. And at the end of the viewing, he said, "Daniel, who do you think are the best, the Specials or the Beat?" And I said, "Of course it's the Specials." He said, "Oh, Daniel, you're already saying that." I think Jerry really thinks that the Beat may have been better than the Specials, and I think their performances, on this, with Mirror in the Bathroom and Big Shots, Ranking Full Stuff. Yes. I mean, they're really sensational performances. I mean, on film, I think they have the disadvantage that Dave Wakelin is stuck to the mic, isn't he? Because he's got a guitar, so he can't hold a microphone, which is not the case for Pauline Black and Rhoda Dakar and Suggs and Cathal and Neville and Terry.
But they do have the jelly legs, of the bass and guitar section, which
yes.
Was hypnotizing as a youth.
You can watch David Steele all day long, can you?
Yeah, you're like, they are moving out of rhythm and playing so in sync. And for me, the beat, those recordings on that in that movie eclipse the recorded versions.
Yes,
like the albums never did it for me the way that these versions did in the movie.
Yeah. I mean, Nightclub for me. That's for a long time. It was the best recorded piece of music I'd ever heard in my life, and the album version is just absolutely magnificent, from that kind of elongated introduction where Horace is doing kind of disco inspired kind of semitone
incredible
intervals on the bass, and then Jerry's the swirling organ, and then when it kicks in, and then you just, every time you hear that Nightclub, you just can't wait to hear how is Terry going to introduce each member of the band, and how is he going to do the sardonic girls, that ad lib about the girls and the beer, or is he going to do a kind one, and it's just sensational. They're playing on that. That's one of the greatest moments of the band. And then you get then you could easily cut to the rock punk energy of Concrete Jungle, where you've got Terry singing this, unlike the album version, which is Roddy singing. The music on this record is just, even Easy Life, by the Body Snatchers.
Absolutely.
When you hear them and see a whole auditorium of 2,000-3,000 people jumping up and down, kind of almost, fists clenched and pounding to the energy of that backbeat, that takes the recorded version to a different level.
I totally agree. Yeah, and just even like the way the Body Snatchers are being filmed walking on the stage with the Steadycam, and they're having the little, Oregon, haunted theme. It's just like you are on the edge of your seat, and then it explodes.
And then you can fall in love with Miranda all over again.
Oh my God, it's so great. Really the only band when I was a kid that didn't do it for me was Bad Manners.
Right.
Like, for some reason, I don't know that much about Bad Manners, but to me, sometimes when you're a kid, you can feel like, well, this feels like a little tacked on, or you could be suspect of things like it. And sometimes you're wrong. It took me a long time to listen to the Stranglers because they looked older and they were wearing trench coats and they had ravens on their cover. And I was like, in my head was like, well, that seems like something for an older audience. And I was wrong. Like, I love them.
Maybe, and they were older when they kind of
right. But but when you're 13 or 12 and you're looking at it and you could do that, or you could do this, you're like, I'm going with that.
I was quite taken by Bad Manners as a kid because I think like Madness, they had a kind of a young sensibility that was more relatable to being young. And on
what, like what?
Well, I mean, Madness was singing about schoolboy japes, weren't they? And
Sure.
Lip Up Fatty by Mad Manners is schoolboy taunting, isn't it? Really. But then you had Inner London Violence, which I think really showed how great a band Madness were. I mean, Bad Manners were. But the image of Bad Manners is Bust the Blood Vessel, and that gives it a comic front that betrays something that's a lot stronger about that band. And I think they went on to make a run of really great pop singles, really brilliant produced, brilliantly played, great songwriting. But you've always got this kind of comic front to it all, in the same way as Madness gave across a kind of a comedy. They played to the comedy of what they were and later tried to move away from it. And I know in the States that Our House it's their only top 10 Billboard hit, isn't it? Yeah. But and it seems bizarre to me that because then it positions them as a comedy band, and I think they were a lot more than that.
Oh, they were genius. And and I never had a problem with Buster. Okay. Like, that was not my problem getting into it. For me, it was actually, really, to tell you the truth, it was the orchestration and choices that the horns made.
Oh, really?
I didn't like their I loved Rico, and Dick, and what they were doing in the specials, and I loved what they were doing with Chaz and Lee and Madness. But for some reason, the horns and Bad Manners, it just, I don't know, it didn't speak to me. Again, there's. It may have been the keys that they were writing in. It could have been anything. I do appreciate Inner London Violence. Yeah, I think that is the best song by them by far in this film.
But I mean, that's interesting what you're picking up on, because when you've got Rico and you've got Saxa in the beat, the tones of those two musicians who have been trained early in the 60s and coming from a jazz kind of influence, is something that nobody can replicate, and
absolutely,
they're stunning players. And the beat will move when Saxa kind of struggles to play on live, and they bring in a new player, and years down the line when Rico doesn't play and they can't play anymore, and they try with new players, you just can't replace that way of playing. I mean, it was just beautiful playing, and unbelievable that these two Jamaicans should choose to play with British punk rock musicians.
The one part of the film that always bummed me out, and I remember being in the theater, which is the middle section. At 42 minutes in, they basically have a 5-minute long piece about the age, of the teenager, and they're looking back at movements in the 50s and 60s of like the locomotion and the bossa nova. And, Joe Dutton said in your book that he said, I would have found it difficult to sustain 86 minutes of nonstop music. And I think he's wrong.
Huh.
I think that this little break in it is like, if you're excited about this film, you don't need this. You want another song in there. It doesn't really, to me, it just stops the gears. And maybe it's because over here in the States, you know, I did not know maybe the relationship to these, you know, Pathé films that, you know, maybe the viewing audience there did. You know, they were like, oh yeah, you know, this is what my parents saw, right? You know, and maybe there's a relationship between, you know, what they were dancing to and what I'm doing now. But what's your feeling about that weird little 5-minute intermission?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing. I mean, I take your point that, and Joe Dunton's point that the film needed its own intermission, and you know, it's really weird watching footage of the shadows, and yet it's quite funny watching syncopating Sandy play the piano for longer than any man has ever played the piano in history, and individually they're kind of fun elements, but you know, it seems to go on in the same way I think Dance Craze is flawed ultimately, because it's hard to sit down and watch just one performance after another. Whereas had I watched this film standing up and you could dance on a floor in front of the screen, I think that would have been quite stunning. But you know, because I've tended to watch it on video and DVD and only occasionally see it in the cinema, that ability to kind of stop it or just jump in at different points, you know, as the years go by, I don't know, a mix really. I mean, the older it gets, the more you realize the value of the film. And I think that's really why there was such a negative response within the bands when the film was first released, because they were all expecting a documentary or some kind of understanding of where two-tone had come from, some kind of history, and you just get performance. I did always, actually, I mean, I just loved it, but I'm absolutely truthful. As I get, you know, maybe into an hour into it, it's like you need a lot of energy to keep going, because, and yet, song for song, it's magnificent. But as a piece of cinema, it asks a lot of an audience, I think.
It seemed like they had a limited camera crew.
Yeah.
And so a lot of this, you know, sometimes the film is half in the dark. You know, you're like watching it and you don't see any of the band. No. You just see some shadows, and it's the best coverage they could have. But yeah, I was kind of blown away. You know, Pauline Black said, you know, there were no interviews, no insights into what the people were like. The image was that of all these people in two-tone bands, black and white, living and working together in total harmony. But of course, it wasn't always like that. We were angry young people.
Yeah.
And I think that, yeah, it would have been amazing to capture some interviews or talk to the fans.
But I think that opinion of the artist and like Pauline has shifted retrospectively, because now, I mean, you can read Too Much Too Young and find out the backstory. You can see there's several documentaries that have been made about two-tone. Two-tone is now kind of has got a broader perspective, whereas in 1981, when this came out, there was more knowledge required to what two-tone was about and meant. So you've got a shift now. So I think you'd find Pauline now being a lot more positive about the film, in the same way as Jerry, who walked out of the original screening, now thinks it's a definitive document of the movement.
So Neil Davis, you know, he refuses the gold disc for the soundtrack because, you know, he says it was false. It was, you know, it was a masquerade.
But he told me for the book, he said, still, the film's rescued by the performances of the selector.
Oh my God.
I didn't put that quote in it.
No, your book is so great at showing the dynamic push-pull of Jerry and him basically, you know, loving the same music at the same time, and Jerry just basically being the first one to step forward to do it. And including him along on that first 45, you know, with the instrumental of the selector. But I wanted to talk about Pauline Black a bit, because she's such a strong figure in the book and in the movie and in the movement. her image, androgynous and, just such a powerhouse and in such an intense band. I mean, the Selecter, I didn't know that much about, as people until reading your book. And that was a tough band for someone to be in.
Yeah, I mean, Pauline's, was, to my knowledge, was the first rude girl by dint of how she dressed and offered something to the girls as a, who just had Walt Jabsco, the two-tone man, to admire to that point. And what I'm always most taken by is that just a few months earlier, Pauline was a solo artist playing in the back room of pubs, doing covers of Joan Armatrading and Sandy Denny. And then suddenly she's fronting a rock band. And from the off, she seems to make that leap with supreme stage confidence. And there's nothing to suggest that she was capable of doing that. Why would you, sitting down on a stool with an acoustic guitar playing Bert Jansch, and so it her vocals are very powerfully delivered. She really thrust the band forward and on into the auditorium, literally by a foot up on the monitor and leaning into the audience and goading them and getting them into what they're doing. And even when you listen to Too Much Pressure, in which strangely she's relegated to little more than a backing singer as opposed to the lead singer of the band. It's her vocal that begins to shine through in the latter part of that single, and then live she comes to the fore a lot more on Too Much Pressure. Yes. And as we know from the other tracks where she is fronts it alongside Gaps, the second vocalist in the Selecter. I just got immense pride and joy in watching and in more recent years getting to know Pauline and doing events with her. I think she's a great woman.
Yeah, she's incredible and still doing it.
I saw her at Wembley last year opening for Blur, and it was just brilliant.
That's incredible.
Wembley Stadium, yeah.
The other thing I'm so glad gets captured in the film, because I'd heard about it, was the audience getting on stage with the specials.
Yes.
And, the film opens with Nightclub, it closes with Nightclub, 2 different versions at 2 different locations. Yeah. But it's so incredible how it's just one person, 3, and then it's like 200 people. Like, it's like over instant. It's just, and it's so fun to see, different races, different ages, different styles, and everyone just dancing, facing out, right?
Yeah.
They're not like looking at Terry or Jerry. They're like performing.
Yeah. And there's the footage that was done at the same time of Enjoy Yourself, and you can't even see where the stage is. It's just incredible. Jerry's surrounded by musicians, and then he ends up on top of his keyboard, doesn't he? And the band are up on risers trying to distinguish themselves from the audience. I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah, it must have felt so great, just to be like, oh my God, okay, now everybody off the stage, we're going to do it again.
Yeah.
And also I'm really glad that, there's, at least to my knowledge, not a lot of footage of them performing stuff from more specials live. So at least we get Man at CNA. Do you remember what your feeling was when more specials came out? Like, were you ready for it? Or were you confused?
When I bought more specials, oddly enough, my version of More Specials is the North American version, which has got Rat Race on it, possibly as the second track, and it's also had the lyrics in it. And you always have to bear in mind that the cassette version, remember cassettes were big at the time, that also feeds into side 1 and side 2, Bragging and Try Not to Lie, by Roddy and Rude Boys Out of Jail, which on the British version of the album are included but as a 7-inch single. So there's different ways of hearing that. And I, as a youngster, because I was still at school, I wasn't a big fan of Stereotype and International Jet Set, which would become a double A-side single of the Specials. So I probably preferred side one because it was more up-tempo, and I wasn't really into ballads at that point. I could just about, I'll take My Girl, but it's an up-tempo ballad anyway. But, side one of more Specials is up-tempo predominantly, isn't it?
For people who haven't heard the record, Jerry Dammers is synthesizing music that he'd heard in the States in elevators. And he's like, I want to jam this kind of lounge culture into the Specials. And it's such a brave, weird move. I mean, I had the same thing. I think I couldn't appreciate it till I was older because it was so different.
Yeah.
Rat Race felt more in line, Enjoy Yourself, the cover.
Yeah.
But yeah, side two was definitely like, oh, this is a come down. This is like really, it was dark, but also very slow and just leaned into like the Oregon with the like bossa nova beat.
Yeah, only in places though. I mean, you still got up tempo stuff, and then there's moments where you have to get the stylus off in case your parents hear the swearing, and those kind of
exactly.
Pearl's Cafe, stuff like that. But I mean, like you mentioned a while back about bootlegs. I've got loads of bootlegs of this, particularly the Specials in the US. And not only on their first tour in early 1980, but after Ghost Town, when they did that tour of the US, the second US tour. And at that point, they're playing tracks of Rico's. They're playing The Boiler, which was the Body Snatchers song. And they've introduced a whole new there's about 10 or 11, 12 people on stage. And they're playing the Ghost Town EP, and they've transformed so much. I mean, it must have been amazing for audiences in the US because it was pointing to what would have undoubtedly been an even more advanced and progressive third album. Nothing like In the Studio, but something more akin to the Ghost Town EP, which was the Specials going back to being the Coventry Automatics in many ways, and playing rock incorporated with reggae as opposed to rock incorporated with ska.
And Ghost Town, there's no better last recording by any band, I'm convinced. I mean, just it floors me every time. I got to see the Specials maybe about 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And I had very low expectations because I just didn't know, how it was going to be. And they came out with Ghost Town, and Goosebumps,
right.
With Terry and Linval. And it really shocked me. Linval at one point goes, "Hey, it's really great to be here in Portland, Oregon. I live up in Gig Harbor, Washington. Come see me sometime." And I'm like, "What? You live in Washington in this small town?" I'm so lucky that you didn't live there in 1981 because I would be taking a bus up there and walking around, staying there all weekend until I spotted you to just be like, excuse me, I just have some questions. But yeah, they were, Terry Hall was still incredible, like just so funny. He sounded great.
Yeah.
But yeah, Ghost Town, that all three songs on that EP are just magnificent.
Yeah, Friday night, Saturday morning with Terry writing his first real full set of lyrics. I don't think he did all of Man and CNA. Just fantastic, aren't they? I mean,
so good.
Yeah, great song. He originally wanted that to be just him and a piano, like a man in a pub. Oh,
that'd been incredible too.
Jerry said no to that.
So did you follow into Funboy 3 and
sure.
Special AKA?
Yeah, massively. I remember seeing the Funboy 3 live, and then they came on to do an encore at the Birmingham Odeon, and they did Gangsters and You're Wondering Now. And I was like, I know what it's like to see the Specials, but I thought Waiting, the second Funboy 3 album, I mean, it's still today one of my
That's an incredible record.
Yeah, one of my favourite records of all time, produced by David Byrne. It's really short. not great, just fantastic lyricism, great melodies. I love the arrangements on it. It's got Our Lips Are Sealed, co-written with Jane Weedlin. Great, ton of love. Always good to play if your sister's going to get married.
And also, Terry was very open about like in songs about being sexually abused on the record and stuff.
Yeah, well, fancy that. Yeah, devastating.
Yeah. It was like really, it was just very eye-opening, and especially for a pop album, I thought was that second album by the Funboy Three is incredible.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like you can't easily place influence on that record. So it's something very different. And David Byrne's production, which you can really feel from the shift from the first Funboy Three album to that, and then the arrangement of is it Caroline, the keyboard player? The arrangements on that record really made it stand out as something special. Great record. And like so many of us who we felt like we grew with Terry Hall and his iterations of the specials into the Colour Field, the great Thinking of You, then what he did with Dave Stewart, all the way through to the Mushtaq album of early 2000s. There were so many things that he did that carried us. That was really exciting, and then ultimately to see that band reform. I saw them when they first played Brixton, and it was just amazing, that gig. And I didn't expect it to be. I was sad that I wasn't going to see Joey Dammers on stage, but within about 10 seconds you'd forgotten that, and it's just I was on the front row. Same just thing. Going mental.
Same thing. I was like, oh, Jerry Dammer's not there. I don't know if it's really the specials with that. I was like, nope, this is pretty incredible.
But then I was told Jerry was at the back of the auditorium at Brixton, so he was there.
Oh, wow. What a mysterious, interesting guy. Like, he is... I can't recommend this book enough. He is such an amazing figure to follow through. He's passionate. He's contradictory. I loved it so much. The Specials, AKA, that album did not initially do very well. Is that correct?
I don't think it was a greatly received album. I mean, I think as an album, it's quite hard to listen to, and yet song for song, it's a very strong album. What I like most about Your Girlfriend, I think, is one of Jerry Dammer's best songs. And then, of course, Nelson Mandela is on that record, and what that goes on to achieve in terms of an education is quite stunning. But it's not the first two Specials albums. It hasn't got it sorely misses Neville and Terry, without a doubt. It hasn't got a strong lead singer on it. That's what I think, in essence, is the problem with that record.
Yeah, no, I agree. I remember really trying to love it more than I wanted to. You know what I mean? Like, I just was like, oh, this is all I'm going to have, right? These two split off parties. I've got Funboy Three over here that are doing something different, and I've got Special AKA, but it says the Specials on the cover.
Yes.
So this is closer, and just forcing myself to love it a little more than I wanted to. And again, in retrospect, you're right. Like, there are some really amazing songs on that record. But when I was younger, I remember being disappointed.
Yeah. Likewise, yeah. It's like Liam and Noel. You listen to their solo albums now, and you can get things out of both of them. But you'd rather be having them both together in Oasis.
Well, I do have an additional question. What were you wearing in the schoolyard after Two-Tone?
Well, the great thing was you didn't need to do very much, because you had black trousers. You just needed to hoist them up a bit higher, make sure your socks were white, switch your school shoes to brogues instead of just Clark's normal boring ones. And if you could get away with it, either put badges over on the emblem on your school blazer, or have the nerve to walk into school with a Harrington or a bomber jacket. So you didn't have to do much to just to transfer.
Amazing. Again, I'm going to put links in the show notes to Daniel's book. Also, he is going to be doing some live question and answers in the States.
Yeah.
So please
talk.
come out and see him. Again, I love this book. I mean, it's been a long time coming for me to find something that wasn't like a little 60-page, summary of the thing with photos in it of the times. And you did an amazing job with it. So thank you so much for that.
That's very kind of you to say, Chris. Thank you.
Yeah. Because as a kid, again, this short period was so important. And I know it's funny. People listening to the show are like, all right, so you went from Devo to The Residents to Wall of Voodoo to Ska to REM. And I'm like, yeah, I did. Again, like you, the movements were short, but I was in it. I didn't want a Moog synthesizer anymore. I wanted a two-tone keyboard, right? I wanted a double-decker keyboard, and that was my dream.
And Rankin Roger was a massive fan of Devo, so maybe you felt the influence coming through the beat.
There we go. Yeah. Well, at the end of every episode, I ask the same question, but I tailor it depending on the film we're talking about.
Right.
So on a scale from 1 to 200, with 1 being the lowest and 200 being the highest, how many members of the audience jumping on stage to dance with the Specials do you give Dance Craze, the film?
How many? As a film in the history of film. Oh gosh. How highly do I rate? That's quite tough, because within and of itself, as a music thing and as what it does for two-tone, it's quite magnificent. But as a standing up, in the history of cinema, it's pretty low. It's going to score pretty low, really.
Yeah, I would give it 130 members from the audience, because I think this is not putting it next to Goodfellas. This is basically looking at the film as our only chance to see these bands at this time, the only documentation we have.
But I'm thinking, in music, don't look, D.A. Pennybaker or the Maysell Brothers, and there are great music films. Right. I don't think this is up there with that.
Okay, then what, 60? 60 kids?
The filming in terms of filming music on stage and capturing the excitement of what it is to see a live band, that it's massive. It's way up there. It's few music films have ever matched what this shows you, because it's on, like Joe Dunton said, you were meant to be watching this film sitting in the third from the front in the audience. You're there, you're in it, and all those moments of darkness is like when you're in an auditorium and suddenly the lights have gone a bit weird and you can't quite see Roddy Radiation or Pauline Black's run off that way and you've lost sight of her. It's brilliant for that, but it's not a great film per se.
Yeah, when we saw this, the audience did get up and dance. It was amazing.
Wow.
It was like a collective thing. It was so naive, but it just was like a couple of people did it, then everybody did it.
Oh, wow.
And it was really fun. And I think also that's why that middle section bummed us out, because it was like, oh, we have to sit down.
Yeah, that's where you run off and go and get yourself a drink or a piece of cake.
Thank you so much, Daniel. This has been brilliant.
It's been great fun. Thank you.
I really appreciate it. And I can't wait to see what you write next, too.
Well, brilliant. I can't wait to come to the US. Big tour. It's a big tour for me. First time ever from east to west coast, west to east coast.
Amazing. Go out and support Daniel. Get the book. And enjoy yourself, everybody.
Hey. Wow. Thank you.
Take care. I'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Revolutions Per Movie. We release new episodes every Thursday. We are a completely independently produced affair, so the best way to support us is to rate and review the show on your favorite podcast app and to subscribe to our Patreon over at patreon.com/revolutionspermovie, where you can get exclusive weekly bonus episodes every Sunday, as well as one-of-a-kind handmade Revolutions Per Movie goods that I send out to you. You can follow the show on social media at Revolutions Per Movie and find more information about our various guests in the episode show notes. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week. Bye!